Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar, which is a presentation of the findings of the National Readiness Report. Hi, I'm Dr. Mac Adkins, founder and Chief Academic Officer here at SmarterServices. I'll be taking you on a tour today of those findings, so I'm glad that you're here. First, as is the case on most webinars, a little bit of housekeeping. You know how this goes. Being a webinar, participants will be muted, but we would like to hear from you. So if you have a question or a thought, go ahead and put that in chat as we're going. My colleague Carol Moody is joining us as well today. She's going to be monitoring chat, and if there is a teachable moment, a question that comes up or a comment that should be shared, she'll interrupt me for that. For other questions, she'll be holding those to the end. We will be allowing some times for question and answer at the end. So please submit your questions and comments using chat as you consider appropriate. We are recording this webinar, and you will be receiving a couple of emails from SmarterServices after the webinar. One of those in a couple of days will have the link to the webinar recording if you'd like to review it or share it with colleagues. You'll also get an email from us immediately after the webinar that has a link to a satisfaction survey, just to let us know what you thought about today's webinar, maybe to submit some ideas for future webinars. One thing that we try to do here at SmarterServices is be more than a vendor, but really be a partner that brings information to you that's relevant, that's useful to you and your organization. So if you have an idea, maybe even if you have a resource person that you'd love to hear a webinar from, indicate that on the satisfaction survey that you'll receive the email from today. So let's begin with a poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll in Zoom. And the question being, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on learner readiness? And I put there kind of a definition of learner readiness, that it refers to both the cognitive and the non-cognitive factors that are indicative of student success. So as you reflect back now on all that we've been through over the last couple of years, to what degree do you think that experience has had an impact on learner readiness, with learner readiness being the construct of goodness of fit, or the degree to which a learner is ready to engage in collegiate level work? So we have some responses coming in now. I'll give that just a few more seconds, and then I'll share these results with you. All right, I'll go ahead and end this poll and share those results. And you should be seeing that there, that yes, a major impact in a negative way definitely was the winner there. Got a couple of votes there for positive ways, and I guess it depends on your perspective and who you ask, but largely this audience feels like it's negative. Well, I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag, but I think you guys that voted negative are going to be in agreement with the data that you'll receive in this presentation today. So Carol, let me know. I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next page in the slide. Are you seeing that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what is the National Readiness Report? It's a report that we try to produce yearly, which provides data from all of the students in that prior year who took the SmarterMeasure Learning Readiness Indicator. It looks at demographic distributions, it presents the scale means, it presents the comparison of means across demographic groups. And one of the neat things is that we've been providing this report for a long time now, back since 2008. And you see in one of those images there that back then it was called Ready. And some of you may have been from institutions that were using SmarterMeasure even back in those Ready days, but just know that we do have this data available longitudinally as well. So what is the SmarterMeasure Learning Readiness Indicator? Most of you know that. We have many of our clients attending this webinar today, but there are others here today that may not be as familiar with the assessment. So let me take a moment just to define what this assessment is. It is an assessment that quantifies a learner's level of readiness for learning in a collegiate environment based primarily on non-cognitive indicators of success. It's been around for a long time, for 20 years now, since 2002. Over that period of time, it's been taken by over 6 million students from over 1,000 institutions, and we average about 800 assessments per day being taken. Now, during this presentation, I'm going to be frequently referring to some of the scales of the assessment. And what you're seeing here in the smaller blue words there, individual attributes, life factors, learning preferences, those are our scale names. So it's important for you to understand what that scale is measuring. So let me give you a little bit of a definition there in case you're not familiar. So what we measure with the assessment, we start out looking at the student internally. We call that individual attributes. So that's things like motivation, procrastination, readiness for willingness to ask for help, locus of control, time management, things that kind of define the learner's learning personality. While we're looking at the learner internally, we also identify their dominant learning style. You may call it learning preferences. It's based on the multiple intelligences model. So that's whether they're visual, verbal, social, solitary, those things. After we've looked at the learner internally, then we look at the learner externally. We call that scale life factors. And that's kind of an environmental scan of what's going on in the learner's life, their availability of time, support from family and employers, having an appropriate place to study, general health, finances, those sorts of things. So those are the first three scales. And then we look at some scales that are really measurements of skill sets. We look at their on-screen reading rate and recall, their technical knowledge and competency. We look at their LMS competency, which is a measurement of the degree that they've had experience using learning management systems. And we also measure their keyboarding rate and accuracy. So all of those scales that I've mentioned fall under the non-cognitive domain, but we also have some optional sections that measure cognitive readiness. We have a math readiness indicator and a writing readiness indicator. If you're not aware of that, that may be something that your school wants to add. These assessments are not designed to be as diagnostic or prescriptive as, say, an AccuPlacer. They're not a placement exam, but they're really a screening exam to maybe determine which students may need to take a placement exam. So both the math and the writing readiness assessment are 30-item instruments that pull from a pool of 90 items. And you see there on the screen the factors that they're measuring. So that's kind of an overview of the scales that we measure, and I'll be referring to those in a little bit. So let's go with a second poll now. And let me get back to my poll drop-down menu. There we go. So this one is, do you think learner readiness varies significantly by gender, age group, ethnicity, and those sorts of things? Do demographic factors matter when it comes to levels of readiness? So the votes are coming in. Not going to give it away yet, but one of those yes or no's is being dominant. We'll give that a few more moments. All right, we'll go ahead and end that. So as you can see there, this audience today strongly feels that demographic factors do matter. And I'm glad you feel that way, because I too feel that these factors are important. And what I'm about to share with you is the degree to which many of these demographic factors are important and indicative and could identify learners who may be at risk. And that's an important thing for your school to be doing and to be responding to. So let's look at these findings. So first of all, an analysis of the demographic factors. Let's define our data set. So during the academic year of 2021, we had almost 500,000 students take the assessment. The data analyzed for this report looks at it during a calendar year. So we're looking at all this data from 2021. One thing it's important to recognize is that the data I'm about to share with you is from all institutions in our database, right? And we serve a variety of institutions, everything from high schools, career colleges, community colleges, state and private colleges, graduate schools. So the unique dimensions of your students may differ from those in the national data set. And something I'll recommend as we're closing about actionable steps you can take is that you can use the admin panel in SmarterMeasure to generate a report of the distribution of all these demographic factors of your school. You may or may not have been aware of that. If you're not aware of that, reach out to your account manager and say, hey, can you show me how I can get a view of the distribution of these demographic scores for my school? It's really easy to do. And what you'll be able to do, because you'll have a copy of this annual report nationwide, so you can compare the scores for your students to those in the nationwide data set. A couple of things to remember as we're looking at this demographic data is that the N is not going to be as high as that 500,000 figure that I gave, because schools can remove, they can edit, or they can replace the demographic questions. Students then may opt out of answering demographic questions. And to be FERPA compliant, we're obviously only reporting this in aggregate, not in any individual student data. So let's look at the demographic factors from 2021, right? That was this last year. So these are of all students at all institutions that took the assessment, and most of the schools we serve are serving traditional age college students, right? So they're almost half, 48% were traditional age college students, 18 to 22. That's significant to notice that about 7% of the students were 17 or below. We do have a version of the assessment that's developmentally appropriate for learners in grades 9 through 12. So if you're at a college and you've got a lot of students who are in it, what's the word I'm looking for? Not advanced classes, but dual enrollment classes. So you may be serving some students who are still in high school, but you'd love to know about their level of readiness. Just know that we do have a version that is appropriate for learners in those grades. And then you can see sort of the distribution across the other age groups as well. Gender. From this national data set was largely female, 62%. I wonder how that compares to your institution. One thing that several schools are asking us about now is that by default, we use that question paradigm that IPEDS has been using for years of asking gender by male and female. Now there are many schools who would love to state that question differently. So just know, if you would like to do that, what you can do is turn off our default question of gender, and then you can add as a custom question, which is asked there in that same section of the assessment. You can phrase the gender question however your institution considers appropriate. So just know that, and it may be a way that you want to customize the assessment for your students. Prior online course experience. Now put a pin in this one, because in a moment when we begin to look at some comparisons, this factor is going to be really, really significant. What this question asks learners is to say, hey, at the moment you're taking this assessment, have you ever had any online courses anywhere else before? If so, how many of those? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or more? And so if you look at this, exactly half of the students nationwide had no prior online course experience, but there's 16% who've had 5 or more online courses. And I think that has ramifications as you're designing things like your orientation course or your student support services for online learners. Know that, like in an orientation course, maybe don't assume that everybody is a newbie. And so sometimes you have to say, this is the way we do distance learning at this institution, because it may be different from the experience they had at another institution. Next is learning styles. And what this is measuring here, obviously, most persons, when they get the results of the learning style part of our assessment, it ranks several of those. What we're plotting here is just what was their dominant learning style. And as you can see there, solitary was the most common, but also almost tied with it was social, right? So learners are kind of, they're spread out across this. And obviously learning styles is a good example of the fact of another way you can customize SmarterMeasure is that you can turn on or off scales. We get it. There's a variety of opinion about learning styles. Some people put a lot of stock into it, others not so much. So if you don't want to ask the learning styles question, you don't have to. I personally like it. If I have this data and I'm an academic advisor or a student success coach, whatever it's called at your institution, and I'm talking with students about their level of readiness and how they approach the learning experience, to me, having this data about their learning style really adds some enriching points to the conversation. Another demographic question that we ask is to the student about the degree to which they feel like this school that they're currently enrolled at is the right school for them. And they're given 4 choices: very confident, confident, not sure, or probably not. Well, the vast majority of students are confident or very confident, but there's 11% of the students that were not sure or they thought they were probably not. Now, why is that important? At several institutions over the last few years, we've done correlational analysis where we're looking at what is the relationship between these SmarterMeasure scores and factors like retention, satisfaction, engagement, and academic success. And I got to tell you, there typically is a super strong, statistically significant correlation between this question of school choice and then especially of retention. Now, that's not rocket science, right? A student that doesn't think they're in the right place may leave, but that's what statistics does, right? Is it just quantifies what we know intuitively. But what we're trying to do here is identify students that are at risk, that we may need to put our arms around, that we may need to give more support to help them stay enrolled at our institutions. So when you have a student that on this assessment indicates that they're not sure or they're probably not at the right institution, take that serious and reach out to them. First generation college students, of all the people that took the assessment across all the schools, almost a third or a little bit over a third, 34% were first generation college students. And you guys know that for persons in this situation in life, this whole new experience that no one in their family has ever done is a real challenge. They just can't, comprehend exactly what it means to be a college student. They don't have some of the very practical strategies about setting up a specific place to do their studying and just all those practical kind of things. And again, this is another variable that typically is a very strong correlate with factors of student success. So when you kind of take a step back and look at all those demographic factors, what would a typical respondent to this assessment look like? Well, they'd be female, traditional aged, Caucasian. They've not had any prior online courses, preferring a solitary learning style. They're very confident in their school choice, and they're not a first generation college student. So think about that. That kind of typifies probably a lot of the students that you're serving. Let's look at one more final poll here. Go down to the third one. And that is, do you think learner readiness has improved or declined over the last decade? And so we here at SmarterServices have been providing SmarterMeasure now for 2 decades. So we're in a great position of being able to look at some things longitudinally, which we're going to look at some of the data here in just a moment. But I'm kind of curious what your inclination is about learner readiness over the last decade. Now, here's why this is important. As I say, we've been doing this now for 20 years. And 20 years ago, distance learning was very different than it is now. It was kind of like the Wild West back then. We were still fighting all of those battles about whether distance learning was even a valid way to learn, right? It's when all of those no significant difference findings were being done in the research. In fact, my dissertation was one of those studies that compared classroom education to online education. And so 20 years ago, that was the big topic. And learner readiness was certainly recognized that yes, that was a major thing. Everybody said, for sure, we've got to measure if students are ready to learn online. And so now there tends to be a question I hear asked more of, is this question of learner readiness still a valid question? Is it the fact that we do so many things now online? We shop online, we bank online, we plan trips online, we receive our entertainment online. Since we're so comfortable doing so many things in an online environment, are we now so comfortable that we're good with learning online? So is this construct of online learner readiness still important? Well, we're about to answer that question with some data. So let's see here how you guys voted about it. I'll share the results. So kind of close there between there's been a major decline or a minor decline, with minor decline receiving most of the votes. But many of you feel like, well, hey, it's improved over the last decade. Well, let's see what the data says about that. I'll stop sharing those results. So I'm going to show you two things here. The first is an analysis of the changes in the mean score on the scales that we measure over the last 4 years. And then we're going to compare 2021 to 10 years ago, right? So first, let's look at it over the last 4 years. And I think why this analysis is really compelling is that our world went through a lot of change over the last 4 years, right? So these first 2 years, kind of consider them a baseline. They were pre-pandemic. That was back in the good old days before we knew what the word COVID meant, right? Can you remember that? So you kind of think about these here, and what you're looking at here is for the academic year, these are the means, the national mean of these scales that we're measuring, right? Now, one caveat is to realize that when we report some of these scales on the student report, not all of these scales are measured on a 0 to 100 scale. For example, math is on a 30-point scale. But for ease of comparison, we converted these to a 100-point scale for this analysis. Now, the red numbers are the lowest mean, right? So all of these scales now are comparable on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 being the highest, right? So the higher the number, the better, the more desired it is. And what jumps out at you? The lowest mean for every one of these scales was either during the quarantine year or during the year when we've been emerging from the quarantine. That's kind of telling, isn't it? In every case, there was a drop there. Now let's look at it a little more closely. Look at life factors and individual attributes. Often people will ask me, they'll say, Mac, of all these scales that you're measuring, which ones are the most important? Or which ones really are the strongest correlates with academic success? Well, after analyzing that data and answering those questions at dozens of institutions, these two are it, right? Life factors and individual attributes. In fact, if I had to rank one of them the highest, I would say it's individual attributes. And if you remember, that's your motivation, control over procrastination, willingness to ask for help, locus of control, things that define that learner's personality. So that's really, really important. And then right after it, those are the life factors. That's that environmental scan of how many hours have they got available to study, and support from family, support from employers, those things. Both of those constructs, very important learner readiness constructs. And again, this is a scale score on a 0 to 100 scale, and look what has been happening over the last 4 years. I mean, a consistent decline for life factors, consistent decline for individual attributes. Now let's go back to that question. People often ask me, does learner readiness still matter? I think so. I think that's what this data is saying. In fact, learner readiness may matter more now than it did in the past, right? Because the mean scores are declining. Our questions are remaining the same, right? So why is it that learners aren't as ready now as they once were? And then you look at what happened there during the pandemic years, especially all of the skills variables that we're measuring: reading recall, technical knowledge, technical competency, keyboarding. All of those experienced the lowest mean ever during that pandemic year. So what does that tell you? Well, there were a lot of students during that quarantine year that were forced to learn online, and online learning was not their first choice. And one of the reasons it was not their first choice was probably because they were lacking in some of these skill areas. And so this assessment revealed that these skill points really suffered during that quarantine period. And then obviously you would expect this one the mean for your prior online courses to be the lowest ever during the quarantine year, because people were forced to learn online that weren't choosing to learn online, right? But then look at how well that recovered for this year, kind of after that quarantine year, because so many people gained experience during the quarantine, right? And then, of course, as you might expect, as is the case with lots of different things like virtual proctoring, we saw a huge increase of it during that quarantine period. And so we did have there during that academic year over 500,000 students, the most ever during a 12-month period, to take the assessment. So I think that's really telling, by all of these lowest means ever being either during the pandemic period or as we're emerging from the pandemic. I put some words here because we'll be disseminating this slide deck after it. I just spoke to those things, so I'm not going to repeat all of that, but I did put that there just to help you see that. A couple of things here that I do want to kind of make an observation on. As I pointed out, the non-cognitive attributes really have declined. That's those life factors and individual attributes. Now, I didn't come in as much. Let me go back. Look at the math and writing readiness. Wow, same thing. Now, the writing readiness, the first year, that's a bit of an anomaly because that first version of the assessment, once we did some reliability and validity analysis on it, it changed after that. So really, these last 3 years is the same assessment bank, right? But if you'll look at what's going on with those mean scores for math and writing, this most recent year is the lowest ever, right? And so that's really concerning, that all of these major non-cognitive factors coupled with the major cognitive factors of math and writing both have displayed the lowest mean score ever in this year after the pandemic. So that's telling us that learner readiness is still very, very important, and still something we must be measuring and we must be responding to. Now, that's kind of the impact that the pandemic had on it. And you guys were exactly right. The pandemic had an impact and it was largely bad, right? That's what this data reveals. So then we ask about the changes over a decade. So here's data from 2011 compared to 2021. Well, we're a little bit more diverse, not quite as strong female. Definitely more diverse when it comes to ethnicities that are taking the assessment. We were over 62% there Caucasian. Now that's 44. That's a good thing. No prior online courses. 55% of the students back in 2011 had not taken any prior online courses. Now that's an improvement there to 50%. So we have more experience going in. At least for the schools that we're serving, that we're giving the assessment to, this is an increase here. So we're serving more traditional age college students than we have before. That may be a shift from us. We initially served a whole lot of community colleges. Now we serve more universities. So that may be a shift as much of the clients that we serve as much as anything. But then you look at this, social learning style declined a little bit. The individual attributes mean, remember, that's the one I said that if there's one of our scales that's more important than the others, it's this one. And look at there, that's a pretty big drop over that 10-year period. Life factors also declined over that 10-year period. Reading recall is a decline. Technical knowledge is a decline. So just further evidence of what I'm talking about is that it's not just the pandemic. There's something else going on here. This is over a 10-year time period, and we're seeing declines in several areas when it comes to factors of learner readiness. Now, one of the things that we do in this annual means report is we say, okay, so we've collected our demographic data. Now, of these populations and each demographic factor, is there a difference between and among these populations when it comes to learner readiness? So a couple of things about this analysis. As I said early on, during this time period, there was 467,000 students, almost 500,000 students that took it. And if you remember from your stats classes, anytime you're doing a comparison of means, you can get sample size error if you have a really, really large sample. So to control for sample size error, we used SPSS to randomly select 1% of the full data. So we're working with 4,678 test takers here during the 2021 calendar year. So, and I realize this is small, but when you get the full report, this is going to be bigger. Plus, there's one other output from an analysis of variance that those of you that remember your stats classes that you can look at, but we can draw some conclusions here. Now, for those of you maybe that haven't had or were asleep during your stats class, let me remind you of one thing. When you're trying to determine if there is a statistically significant difference between two populations, what you're looking for here is this significance, and you want it to be a 0.05 or less. And what that's showing is that, there's 95% chance that this relationship did not happen by chance, that there's really something going on here. And so when you look at this significance column here and you see all zeros, that means there's definitely a statistically significant difference between those. Here's 0.07. So this one is not, because it's greater than 0.05. Another double zero. That one is, it's 0.02. So we've got a couple things here that are not. So what does this mean? Well, age does matter. And students who are not traditional age college students, meaning that they're older, did have statistically significant higher means in several of these categories, right? Individual attributes, life factors, reading, technical knowledge, technical competency, right? So, older students have more life experience and they tend to be at a higher level of readiness. How about gender? Well, gender didn't matter as much as age, right? So when you look over here in the significance column, there's one that's significant, but you got several that are not. There's another one that was, another one that was. So how did this break out? Well, in the full report, there's one other output table from the analysis of variance that we didn't have room for on this screen, but it will actually show you the means for all of the population, so you can see which population was the highest. But here I just kind of interpreted it textually. So females did have statistically significant higher means for individual attributes and math readiness. So think about that. You know what individual attributes is: your motivation, control over procrastination. Females did better. Males did better for technical knowledge. So that seems a little bit stereotypical, right? But the data yields it out, right? The guys were a little bit better with using their computers, and the girls were a little bit better with controlling their responses to their emotions and that sort of thing. Now, ethnicity. This one I think was really encouraging. There were several significant factors, but there was no one ethnic group that was highest in everything, right? African Americans had the highest mean for life factors. Caucasians were highest for reading, keyboarding, and technical competency. Asian or Pacific Islanders were the highest for technical knowledge. So ethnicity matters, but there's no one dominant ethnic category. Online learning experiences. Remember when we first talked about this a few minutes ago, I said, put a pin in this one and think about it. Now, when you look over here in this significance column, look at that, triple zeros all the way down. There's only 2 of these that are not statistically significant. So online learning experience is the demographic factor that was the strongest determinant of levels of readiness. And that really just stands to reason, right? That as a student has more experience in online learning, the more ready they're going to be for online learning. And so that question that we ask about what is your level of experience, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, when you've got a student that's taken 5 or more online courses, man, put your arm around them and say, we're glad you're here, because they've got a very high likelihood that they're going to succeed and be retained. But when you see a student that's got that 0 there, realize that they really need to be embraced. They really need to be supported early on. If you can get them to stick around, just, if they're taking 2 online courses each semester, make it through that first year, because if they can get over that experience hump, then things may be much better for them when it comes to learner readiness. Remember that factor about school choice. We've got some statistically significant findings here that it does make a difference. Students who felt confident that they were at the right school did have statistically significant higher means for individual attributes, life factors, and technical knowledge. And remember, individual attributes and life factors, those are the 2 biggies, right? So those students that are in control of their choice are also a little bit more in control over their learning and their environment. And so that's really a telling factor. And then, of course, first generation college students, again, a very telling factor that for students that are first gen, they continue to struggle. Obviously, this is a population that you want to support. And fortunately, there's a lot of federal programs that give your schools funding to reach out to these populations. And that certainly continues to be a valid thing for schools to do. So what are the conclusions from all of these comparisons of different populations within our demographic factors? Well, age does impact readiness. The older you are, the more ready you are. Gender does not as strongly impact readiness. Ethnicity matters, but there's no one dominant ethnic group. Prior online learning experience is the strongest correlate of learner readiness. Students that are confident are most ready, and being a first generation college student continues to be a challenge. So as you think about and reflect on all of this for your institution, here are some questions you can ask. You can say, well, how did levels of learner readiness at our institutions compare to national means? It's very easy for you to do that. If you don't know how to run that report in the admin panel, reach out to your account manager, and they can show you how to run that report. And so you can compare your means to the means in this report. You may also want to do an analysis of, well, to what degree did the pandemic change level of readiness at our institutions? So all you do in the admin panel is you change the date range for the data that you're searching. Put in a date range that was during the quarantine and a date range that was before or after, and then do that comparison. How has learner readiness changed over time? Some of you are at schools that have been using SmarterMeasure for many years. So you can put in a date range that was several years ago and run that analysis. And then, are there statistically significant differences between our demographic groups? This is something, you may have the capacity to do. You may have someone in your institutional effectiveness office that can help you with that. You may go to a stats faculty member, or you can call us. I'll be glad to help you do that sort of thing, because I really want to help clients understand this dynamic of learner readiness with their students, because I feel like it is more important than it's ever been, right? So what are some actions that you can take at your institution as you reflect on this data? Well, continue to measure, especially non-cognitive readiness, because this data shows that it matters more than ever. Students are not as ready as they used to be. Compare these levels of readiness in these demographic factors across your populations with the intent of identifying the populations that are most at risk. I mean, if you're a data geek like me, it's fun to do the comparisons, but so what, right? Once you've identified what are the populations at my school that are most at risk, then you can factor that into all of your student success initiatives that you have. And then make changes based on those findings. If there's anything that you're doing that's weak, so maybe like look at your orientation for online students. If there's nothing in your orientation that speaks to students that have experience, that have already taken 5 or more courses, add some content there to where you're saying, hey, here are some things that are unique perhaps about the way we do e-learning at our institution that may be different about where you were before. And then once you've made these changes, once you've analyzed your data, communicate that internally. I mean, I get excited about this. I think you get excited about this, We had 117 people register for this webinar. Lots of people are really interested in this data, but that's within our community of e-learning professionals. And the reason I asked that question early on about to what degree do you think the pandemic helped or hurt the perception of e-learning is all of us who are e-learning professionals, you know, we've got to go to battle. We've got to stand up for this thing that we believe in of distance education, because in many cases, I think the pandemic hurt that perception because there was emergency remote instruction that was not as well planned and delivered as what we think of as typical distance education, right? So we're having to fight that battle of perception. So as you're looking at this data for your students, communicate it outside of your department of e-learning, because you are the professionals, you are the knowledge about this topic on your campus. So right there on time, we've got 20 minutes now for questions and answers, and I'll pause and let Carol kind of prompt me. I see out of one of my eyes that there are some questions here. So Carol, any that need to first?
Yeah, got a question about why are the degrees of freedom values so different across the various measures?
Well, I would have to look at that and think about it a little bit. If you'll shoot, whoever asked that, if you'll shoot me an email, just Mac@SmarterServices. What I'll do is we'll look at some of the full SPSS output and look at our data set and see if we can see some clues there. I really don't know off the top of my head what the answer to that would be.
And then the next question was, do we have citations about the ANOVA results?
Yeah, what I could do is, and if some of you are English teachers perhaps that are better at writing a citation, I'm not sure if we've come up with the appropriate APA format of how to cite this report, but I'll add that to my list, and after this webinar can send that to you.
Okay, great. We've got someone who's new to SmarterMeasure and would like to do some comparison to the national report. So again, just reach out to you, Matt, correctly. It's Shawnee Samuels.
Yeah, so that's what my role here is, Chief Academic Officer, and nothing brings me more joy than to help our client institutions make sense out of their data. So yeah, just reach out to me and let me know what are the questions you have. We'll pull your data. Something we've, like this report is looking at the national data set of all school institutions. It's very common where schools will come to us and say, okay, that's good, but we're a community college, or we're a technical college that focuses on health sciences. We love to our results to peer institutions. Well, we can do that kind of thing as well. Obviously, we can't share a data set from another institution with you, but we can pull that and then sanitize that for the analysis.
I don't see anything else specifically listed in chat. Feel free to put some oh wait, we've got another question from David. Any recommendations for individual instructors regarding course design that could help or support institutional efforts?
Yeah, so I think in your course orientation, because that factor of prior online learning experience was such a strong correlate, I think speak to that reality in your, if this is an online course that you're teaching, that you acknowledge that there's some persons in the course that this is a new experience, and for others it's old hat, and just kind of express what the resources for support are for those persons who are new to it, and make those resources clear, because so many e-learning students aren't aware of all of the resources that your school may provide. Maybe you've got free tutoring that you provide online. Maybe you've got counseling services that you provide online. There were a few questions that were submitted at the time of registration, and one of those related to the relationship between mental health concerns that we became more aware of during the pandemic. And, you know, when you look at several of these things that we're measuring, especially about individual attributes, while the SmarterMeasure assessment does not ask any questions about a person's mental health. There may be some clues when you look at, especially individual attributes, the construct of locus of control, which if you're not familiar with that, that's this feeling of a person with high or external locus of control feels like they're in control of their destiny. And if they apply themselves, they will be successful. A person with low or external locus of control feels like no matter how hard I try, something's going to go wrong because it always does. So I think sometimes that defeatist attitude could be an indicator of depression or some other mental health concern. And so while this assessment's not designed to identify those students, I think if the counselors or the mental health professions at your organization are working with a student, and as appropriate, if they could be made aware of the student's readiness scores, just like many schools make academic advisors aware of SmarterMeasure scores. I think if you're a mental health professional and you're working with a college student, that their results on an assessment like this, could be one other piece of information that they could help give the student insight into their own mental health. Another topic that kind of came up in a question before this was about what have we learned about the digital divide coming out of the pandemic? There's actually a blog. If you go to SmarterServices.com and then click on blog up at the top, you can search our blogs because there's lots of them out there. But if you'll just search for digital divide, you'll find one that I did, a couple of months ago, where I looked at a few different resources of organizations that have data about that. And while, the digital divide was something that we gave lip service to before the pandemic, we often mentioned it, in conference presentations, the pandemic really, really, really exposed what a true thing it was, right? And it's not just a have and have nots situation, right? I mean, there were persons who did have high bandwidth internet access in their home, but they've got so many people living in that home with multiple devices consuming, that same access that when you're trying to do something like, watching an instructional video, it may not be a good experience. And so lots of facets of the digital divide that came out of that. If you look up that blog post, that may give you some additional insight.
Mac, I also posted one of my favorite blogs of yours when you talk about instructional strategies. One of the best places to put SmarterMeasure can also be inside a course. And the blog that I posted there talks about how we're used in first-year experience programs. And one of the resources in that blog talks about using SmarterMeasure in a course. So I attached that blog. We also have another suggestion from Anastasia in the chat. That it can be a good idea to share strategies that you use taking online classes with your students. She teaches a freshman writing course, but is also a graduate student in online courses. And she said in a survey she did of her class, students really appreciated that she communicated with them about strategies for success in online courses in both her announcement and in her video lectures.
Yeah. Students need to know that you care about this, right? Because especially those students that are really experiencing high degrees of frustration and anxiety that relate to their level of readiness, when they know that the instructor is on their side, that can make a big difference. And Carol was talking about putting the assessment even in an academic course. And a good practice that I've seen done is, I'm thinking one school specifically that put it in an English 101 course. Well, early in an English 101 course, you'd like to have a writing sample from the student, right? Well, what better thing to get the student to write about than themselves? So what they did was they had the student to take SmarterMeasure. Then they were to compose a 2-page essay about their level of readiness. Well, think about what that's doing. That prompted the student not just to take the assessment, but to internalize their scores to the point that they could compose an essay about it. Plus, it provided that early writing sample to the faculty members. So I thought that was a good practice as well. One of the other questions that came out before the webinar was, we'd like to hear commentary on how this readiness trend and the trend away from entrance and placement testing are working together against each other for long-term student success. So, as you guys know, because of the pandemic, students weren't able to go out and take standardized tests, ACT, SAT. So during the pandemic, a lot of schools waived that requirement. So it was more of an open admissions environment, right? Well, guess what happened? The level of diversity of their students went up. More students that applied went up, right? When they removed that barrier, it helped a lot of students. And now as they're looking at retention trends among those students who might not have been in their institution to begin with, they're seeing those students perform equally as well. So even now, coming out of the pandemic, we've got a lot of schools. I may be wrong here, but I think it's the case that all of the higher ed institutions in California are not using standardized tests in admissions. And so it's a real trend. And so we've had several schools come to us and say, hey, so we're not using ACT or SAT, we're not using cognitive readiness as an admissions criteria, but we'd still like to know which students are at risk. To what degree is SmarterMeasure appropriate for that? So my response is kind of two-part. First of all, recognize that SmarterMeasure by its design was not intended to be an admissions criteria assessment. It was not intended to be a gatekeeper assessment. It was intended to be a student success tool. So after a student they've applied, they've been accepted, then they're given this assessment, and then based on their scores, the school says, okay, here's how we can help a student like you be successful. One of the problems of if you use a non-cognitive assessment like this, because it is a self-assessment, students are self-rating their strengths and their weaknesses. And if they feel like their answers to that, or if they feel like their admissions to the institution is dependent on their answers, well, what are they going to do? They're going to game the assessment to tell you what they think you want to hear. That's not what we want at all, right? So I caution schools about doing that. We do have some institutions that do that. There's even one accrediting agency that kind of requires it of a lot of schools. So in the appropriate environment, when students are appropriately counseled about, how to take this assessment and how the data is going to be used, it can be used as one of the factors that's in the admissions decision, but we just caution against using it as a sole metric of an admissions decision because that's not what it's there for. But kind of back to this question. So if we don't have that large standardized test score, could you use something like the math and writing readiness indicators to give you some clue? I think that's a very, very appropriate use of that part of the assessment. And the math and writing components are newer. Those may be skills that your school's not currently using. If that's the case, reach out to your account manager. They can tell you, what you need to do to get that going. But realize that those assessments weren't designed to be as rigorous as the ACT, right? But if you as a student answer 30 questions and you saw the list of all those math constructs, you're going to get a pretty good idea of that student's capacity, right? And so if you use math and writiness in lieu of that, and again, you're not saying, hey, your admissions decision is being based on this, but it's part of the portfolio as we're evaluating your likelihood to succeed, then that may be an appropriate use of that scale of the assessment.
Matt, we had another great feedback I wanted to share from Stephanie. She talked about presence in the course is equally important. If an instructor appears unavailable, it's difficult to ask questions. When instructors are engaged with frequent announcements, face-to-face virtual meetings, and feedback in real time, it makes the online experience easier. And she said that's also been made it easier for herself as well when she's participating in courses.
Absolutely. In fact, we've had a lot of schools that have administered SmarterMeasure, even though it's intended for students, they give it to their faculty members as a professional development experience. One, so that they understand this assessment that their students may be taking, but two, that they respond to it. Because think about these constructs, especially for adjunct faculty members that may not be full-time employees of the institution. Their availability of time, their appropriate place for teaching online, their technical competency, their learning styles are probably going to be reflective in their teaching styles. And so there's so many parallels there that a lot of schools have given the assessment to their faculty members. So if that's something your school hasn't done, reach out to your account manager. They'll show you how to set up a test taker group just for your faculty. So the data is not, all mixed in with your student data, and it may be a good professional development experience for your faculty.
That pretty much wraps up everything that I have in chat. I'd just like to speak on behalf of the sales team. If any of you are not current users of SmarterMeasure, you'll get, of course, follow-up resources from the webinar. If you'd want to know more, would like to kick the tires of the assessment or ask some more questions in detail, just let us know. And one of the 3 members of the sales team would be happy to reach out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Carol. Obviously, we're not intending this to be a sales approach, but if we could sell it to somebody else, I'd be glad to do that, not just to make money, because I know there will be additional students that would be benefiting from this, because I'm passionate about this construct of learner readiness. I do believe it matters more than ever, and there's so many of our students out there that need our support, and so we need to identify who those students are. If you're not familiar with us here at SmarterServices, we've been around for 20 years. That's a long time for an ed tech company, right? We've served over 1,000 institutions. We also proctor exams through Smarter Proctoring. If your school is looking for a proctoring solution, what we do that's different is, in addition to all of the virtual proctoring modalities, which is automated virtual proctoring where the AI is watching them, to record and review virtual proctoring where we record it and then a proctor looks at it later, to live virtual proctoring where one of our live humans is watching them. All of those are the 3 flavors of virtual proctoring. That's what pretty much all virtual proctoring companies do. But in addition to that, we also use the same interface for scheduling virtual proctoring as we do for managing face-to-face proctoring. That could be in your testing centers, that could be with instructor as proctor, that could be with a proctoring professional, such as a pastor at a church or an education services officer in the military. And then, so while we've got the 3 face-to-face modalities and the 3 virtual modalities, our newest one is right there in the middle. We call hybrid virtual proctoring, which allows someone at your institution.
Hey, Mac, you need to go one more slide over.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. To be the virtual proctor. So that could be some of the employees in your test center. That could be some of the employees in your e-learning division. That could be some of your faculty if they want to, or it could be employees that your school hires just for this purpose. Maybe you've got some federal funding that is providing student support services, and that's something this could qualify for. So someone from your institution is that live virtual proctor that's watching the student take the test. And so what we provide is the platform that they use for that. And during the pandemic, a lot of faculty members, especially, tried to proctor with Zoom, and that was a total nightmare for so many reasons. Go to our blog and you'll read several posts about why Zoom was not intending as a proctoring platform. But we provide Smarter Proctoring that is a great platform where your staff, your testing center staff, your faculty members can actually provide the proctoring. So we're at the top of the hour. Thank you guys for sticking around today. Do reach out to me. Let me go one more. There's my email address. What I enjoy doing is talking with people about learner readiness. And if something was said today that you've got a question about or you'd like help about at your institution, that's what I'm here for. So thank you for joining us today.